What you are about to hear is not fiction. It is not theory. It is one of the darkest and most deliberately buried chapters in 20th century history. Real names, real roots, real money, and a silence that lasted for decades, protected by governments, churches, and intelligence services that chose convenience over judgment. April 1945. Berlin is in flames. The Third Reich is collapsing under the weight of two armies converging from opposite sides of the continent. Hitler commits suicide in the bunker. Goering flees. Himmler attempts to negotiate. And Goebbels poisons his own children before killing himself. But while the world watched the most spectacular collapse in modern history, something was happening behind the scenes that should never have happened. Not as desperate fugitives running through forests with forged documents. No. They escaped with diplomatic passports, with money, with escorts, with the silent blessing of institutions that should have delivered them to justice. And the final destination for many of them? Argentina, a country far enough from the Nuremberg Tribunal, close enough to the Nazi resources transferred over the years, and governed by a man who understood exactly what these fugitives could offer. What you are about to discover will change the way you see World War II, the post-war world, the Catholic Church, American intelligence services, and the very idea of international justice. Many of them died of old age, in peace, in South America, with new identities and old fortunes, while their victims rotted in mass graves scattered across Europe. To understand Eagle Flight, you need to understand the panic that gripped the Nazi leadership in the final months of the war. In 1944, with the Normandy invasion successful and the Red Army advancing from the east at a terrifying speed, it became clear to the most perceptive men of the Third Reich that collapse was inevitable. The question was no longer whether Germany would lose. It was what would happen to them when it did. Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary and one of the most powerful men in the Reich, initiated in 1944 what historians call Fluchtkapital, escape capital. Money, gold, artwork, and industrial assets were systematically transferred out of Germany to Switzerland, to Spain, to Argentina. Documents from the US Treasury, declassified decades later, estimate that the equivalent of billions of modern dollars were transferred to accounts in Swiss and Argentine banks between 1943 and 1945. The routes had to be created. The networks had to be built. Destination countries had to be convinced to receive these men without asking questions. And above all, clean documentation had to be guaranteed. Here enters a figure who will appear repeatedly in this story. Odilo Globoknik. Globoknik was the SS Obergruppenführer responsible for Operation Reinhard, the extermination program that murdered approximately 2 million Polish Jews in camps such as Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec. When the war began to turn, Globoknik was among the first to start planning his escape. He didn't manage to get away. Captured by the British in Austria in May 1945, he swallowed a cyanide capsule before he could be taken in for interrogation. But the network he helped build, the network of contacts, financing, documents, and escape routes, survived. And it was refined by others. The name in English is rat lines, lines of rats. The name is deliberately dehumanizing, but there is a cruel irony in it, because the rats in this case were human beings who had committed the worst crimes of the century and were escaping through the sewers of history while the world celebrated victory over Nazism. The rat lines were organized escape routes that connected defeated Germany and Austria to countries in southern Europe, primarily Spain and Italy, and from there to destinations in South America. The first was the Vatican route, which passed through Italy. The second was the Spanish route, which crossed occupied France or Switzerland before reaching Franco's Spain, and from there ships departed for South America. The Vatican route is the most documented and the most disturbing. Rome, 1945. The city was liberated by the Allies in June 1944, and in the immediate post-war period it became one of the main transit centers for Nazi fugitives. Why? Because Rome had something that no other European city had at that moment: the Vatican. And inside the Vatican, there was a man who believed, with a conviction that blended religious fervor with ice-cold political pragmatism, that the Nazis could be useful in the war that truly mattered, the war that was still to come, the Cold War against Soviet communism. Hudal was an Austrian priest who directed the Pontifical Teutonic Institute of Santa Maria dell'Anima in Rome, an institution dedicated to German-speaking Catholics in Italy. In 1937, he had published a famous book in which he attempted, either extraordinarily naively or extraordinarily calculatingly, to reconcile Nazism with Catholicism. With the end of the war, Hudal became the central operator of the Vatican escape network. In his memoirs published in 1976, he himself wrote that he had helped save many German and Austrian soldiers and civilians from the Allies' political revenge. What he did not say explicitly, but what documents prove, is that among those soldiers and civilians were some of the greatest war criminals in history. Franz Stangl, commandant of Treblinka, where 90% of those who arrived were killed in the gas chambers in less than 2 hours. Gustav Wagner, the deputy commandant of Sobibor, called the Beast by survivors. Alois Brunner, assistant to Adolf Eichmann and responsible for the deportation of more than 100,000 Jews. All of them passed through Hudal's network. All of them received documents from the International Red Cross, which during that period issued travel papers to war refugees with minimal oversight that bordered on criminal negligence. All of them reached Argentina. This is the question that anyone asks when they begin studying the rat lines. Why did a South American country become the preferred destination for the most wanted war criminals in the world? The first layer is geographic. Argentina lies on the other side of the Atlantic. In 1945, before the age of satellites and the internet, it was genuinely far away. A person who arrived there with false documents and changed their name could literally disappear. The second layer is cultural. In 1945, Argentina had the largest German community in South America. Cities like Bariloche, in the south of the country, had streets with German names, German churches, German schools. A man who arrived speaking only German could survive for years without needing to learn a single word of Spanish. Perón came to power in 1946, elected on a nationalist populist program that blended elements of European fascism with labor-oriented rhetoric. He had served as a military attaché in Rome during part of the war and was an open admirer of Mussolini. For Perón, receiving German scientists, engineers, and military officers was not a scandal. It was state policy. The Argentine historian Uki Gogni, in his book The Real Odessa, documents how Perón's government created institutional structures to facilitate the arrival of Europeans with compromised pasts. Argentina's immigration department, under direct guidance from the presidency, accepted visa applications from Europeans without conducting adequate background checks. In some cases, Argentine consulates in Europe were explicitly instructed to facilitate the arrival of certain individuals. There was also a financial dimension that is impossible to ignore. The gold and assets transferred by the Nazis during the war needed to be deposited somewhere. Argentine banks, with the tacit agreement of the government, became repositories for fortunes of criminal origin. The Banco Germanico, the Banco Alemán Transatlántico, and other financial institutions in Buenos Aires received deposits of questionable origin that were never properly investigated. This is one of the most debated questions among historians who study the Nazi post-war period. The name Odessa, a German acronym for the Organization of Former SS Members, was popularized by Frederick Forsyth's novel The Odessa File and the 1974 film of the same name. The historiographical question is this: did Odessa exist as a formal organization with a hierarchical structure, registered members, and coordinated operations? Or was it an informal network of contacts, favors, and complicity without a clear central command? The honest answer is probably both, depending on what you mean by organization. What the documents prove beyond any reasonable doubt is that organized networks of support for Nazi fugitives existed. These networks had funding. They had contacts within religious, governmental, and financial institutions, and they operated with a level of coordination that goes far beyond coincidence. Simon Wiesenthal, the famous Nazi hunter who devoted decades of his life to tracking war criminals, repeatedly stated that he had found evidence of a central organization. The documents he uncovered during his investigations suggested a structure he called Odessa. Other investigators, such as the British historian Guy Walters, are more skeptical. In his book Hunting Evil, Walters argues that the evidence for a centralized organization is weaker than often claimed, and that much of what was attributed to Odessa was actually a combination of smaller networks, individual initiatives, and sheer luck on the part of the fugitives. Nazi war criminals fled. They received help. They reached Argentina. They lived in peace for decades. And the institutions that should have delivered them to justice often look the other way. Call it Odessa or call it whatever you want. The result is the same. Lieutenant Colonel of the SS, head of the Gestapo's Department of Jewish Affairs, the logistical mind behind the Holocaust. Eichmann was not the man who created the gas chambers, but he was the one who coordinated the transport of millions of European Jews to extermination camps with the efficiency of an operations manager. In 1945, Eichmann escaped from American prisoner of war camps in Austria using a false name. He spent the following years hiding in Germany and Austria, eventually reaching Genoa in 1950 with a passport issued by the International Committee of the Red Cross under the name Riccardo Clement. In July 1950, he boarded the ship Giovanna C. bound for Buenos Aires. He lived in Argentina for a decade. He worked in a Mercedes-Benz factory. He raised his children. He lived an apparently normal middle-class life in a suburb of Buenos Aires called San Fernando. He was captured by the Mossad in May 1960 on Garibaldi Street in Buenos Aires, secretly taken to Israel, tried in Jerusalem in a trial broadcast to the entire world, sentenced to death, executed in 1962, the angel of death of Auschwitz, an SS doctor who conducted experiments on living human beings in the extermination camp with a particular obsession with twins. His experiments included injections of chemical substances directly into the eyes in an attempt to change their color, surgeries without anesthesia, and attempts to artificially create twins through experimental fertilization. Mengele escaped to South America with documents under the name Helmut Gregor. He arrived in Argentina in 1949. He received Argentine citizenship in 1956, still under a false name. As investigations intensified after the capture of Eichmann, Mengele fled to Paraguay and later to Brazil, where he lived under the name Wolfgang Gerhard in the countryside of the state of São Paulo. He drowned in Bertioga, on the coast of São Paulo, in February 1979. He was 67 years old. He was never tried. He never faced justice. The bones were exhumed in 1985 and identified through forensic analysis in 1992. The Butcher of Lyon. Head of the Gestapo in the French city of Lyon during the occupation, Barbie was responsible for the murder and torture of hundreds of people, including Jean Moulin, the principal leader of the French resistance. Barbie is one of the most revealing cases of the rat lines because his files were partially declassified by the United States. What they show is disturbing. After the war, Barbie was recruited as an informant by the American Army Counterintelligence Corps, the CIC. The Americans knew who he was. They knew what he had done. And they used him anyway because he had knowledge of communist networks in post-war Europe. When the French began investigating the crimes in Lyon and closing in, it was American CIC officers themselves who organized Barbie's escape. He was sent through the Vatican route, passed through Italy with false documents, and boarded a ship to South America. He arrived in Bolivia in 1951. He used the name Klaus Altmann for decades. He worked as an intelligence agent. He collaborated with Bolivian intelligence. And, according to accusations never proven but widely documented, he may have participated in the capture of the guerrilla fighter Ernesto Che Guevara in 1967. Barbie was discovered in 1971 by two French researchers, extradited to France in 1983, tried in Lyon in 1987 for crimes against humanity. Sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in prison in 1991. The Barbie case opens a window into the most uncomfortable dimension of this entire story. It was not only religious institutions and authoritarian South American governments that facilitated the escape of Nazi war criminals. American intelligence services, particularly the OSS and its successor, the CIA, were also involved. Because in 1945, while the world celebrated victory over Nazism, Washington was already calculating the next war, and the next war was against the Soviet Union. Scientists, counterintelligence specialists, former members of Nazi espionage networks in Eastern Europe, experts in anti-communist operations, all had value to the Americans, and the Americans paid in strong currency, clean documents, safe passage, and de facto immunity. Operation Paperclip is the most famous of the American programs for recruiting Nazi specialists. Under this program, more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were brought to the United States after the war. Many had dark pasts. Some had used slave labor in concentration camps. Wernher von Braun, the father of the American space program, had been a member of the Nazi Party and the SS. The V-2 rockets that bombed London were built in the Mittelbau-Dora camp using slave labor. It is estimated that more people died building the rockets than were killed by the rockets themselves. Von Braun was brought to the United States, received American citizenship, and led the development of the Saturn V rocket that carried Neil Armstrong to the moon in 1969. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented history, confirmed by documents declassified by the American government itself. What the Americans did with von Braun and the scientists of Operation Paperclip was more or less an official operation, with paperwork, presidential approval, and a narrative of justification. What they did with Barbie and with other second- and third-tier criminals, the torturers, the local Gestapo chiefs, the officers of smaller camps, was more informal, dirtier, and much easier to deny. Documents from the American CIC show that between 1947 and 1951, several former SS and Gestapo officers were kept as active informants in Europe, with regular salaries and explicit protection from legal prosecution. When the situation became unsustainable, when Europeans began investigating too closely, the solution was simple: the route to South America. If you look at the map, Bariloche is located in the far south of Argentina, in Patagonia, at the foothills of the Andes. It is a postcard city: snow-covered mountains, deep blue lakes, forests of araucaria trees. It looks like a piece of Switzerland or Bavaria transplanted into the southern hemisphere. Bariloche was founded in the early 20th century by German and Swiss immigrants. Its alpine architecture, its artisanal chocolate, its wooden lodges with steeply sloped roofs, everything was deliberately built to replicate the aesthetic of the Austrian Tyrol. In the post-war years, Bariloche became one of the main destinations for European fugitives with compromised pasts. Priepke was an SS officer who took part in the Ardeatine Caves massacre in March 1944, when 335 Italian civilians and prisoners were executed in Rome in retaliation for a resistance attack. Priepke personally shot 2 of the prisoners. After the war, Priepke arrived in Argentina via the Vatican rat lines. He settled in Bariloche. He opened a grocery store. He became a member of the community. He participated in social activities. In town, he was known as Don Errico. He was discovered in 1994 by American journalist Sam Donaldson of ABC News, who interviewed him on the street in Bariloche. During the interview, Priepke confirmed that he had taken part in the massacre but denied personal responsibility. Arrested in 1994, Priepke was extradited to Italy and tried for war crimes. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1998. He died in Rome in 2013 at the age of 96, still in custody. But how many others lived and died peacefully in Bariloche and in other Argentine cities without ever being found? No large-scale escape operation happens without funding. And the funding for the rat lines comes from one of the darkest stories of the post-war period: Nazi assets. During the war, Nazi Germany accumulated one of the largest plunders in history: art confiscated from museums and private collectors throughout occupied Europe, dental gold extracted from prisoners before they were executed, money, jewelry, and property seized from Jewish families who were deported. A significant portion of this wealth was systematically transferred out of Germany before the final collapse. Switzerland was the preferred destination. Swiss banks, protected by the strictest banking secrecy in the world, accepted deposits of Nazi origin without asking questions. The Swiss National Bank purchased gold from Germany throughout the war. Gold that, according to studies by the Swiss government decades later, included metal taken from Holocaust victims. In 1997, an independent commission created by the Swiss government and led by historian Jean-François Bergier published a devastating report. The Bergier report confirmed that Swiss banks had systematically collaborated with the Third Reich and that billions in assets of Jewish or Nazi origin remained in the banks without claimants. Swiss banks eventually created a compensation fund after decades of international pressure, but no banker was ever tried. No institution was dissolved. The system that allowed the laundering of Nazi gold continued operating as if nothing had happened. In Argentina, the pattern repeated itself. Documents obtained by Argentine investigators in the 1990s and 2000s showed suspicious transactions in Buenos Aires banks that coincided with the arrival of Europeans with no financial history, but carrying large sums of money. The money bought properties. It bought businesses. It bought silence. Simon Wiesenthal was born in 1908 in Poland, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He survived 12 different concentration camps, including Mauthausen. When he was liberated by the U.S. Army in May 1945, he weighed 45 kilograms. 89 members of his family were murdered by the Nazis. Wiesenthal dedicated the rest of his life to a task most people considered impossible: finding the war criminals who had escaped justice and ensuring they would be tried. He worked alone for years with minimal resources, in a time without the internet, without digital databases, only paper archives, correspondence, and a network of volunteer informants spread across Europe and South America. Wiesenthal was responsible for locating the whereabouts of Adolf Eichmann, passing the information to Israeli intelligence. He helped lead to the capture of Franz Stangl. He located dozens of other lesser-known criminals. His work was driven by a single principle: that time does not erase crime, that there is no statute of limitations for mass murder, that survivors have the right to see their tormentors stand before a judge. Wiesenthal died in Vienna in 2005 at the age of 96. Until the end, he said the work was unfinished. Decades after the end of World War II, archives are still being declassified. Investigations are still being opened. And questions that should have been answered in 1945 are still waiting for answers. How much Nazi gold remains in Swiss banks, identified but not returned? Who exactly financed the escape operations? How many criminals reached South America who were never identified? What exactly was the role of the Vatican? Not individual figures like Hudal, but the institution itself? To this day, the Vatican has never fully opened its archives from the wartime period. In 2020, Pope Francis authorized the partial opening of the archives from the pontificate of Pius XII, the Pope who led the Church during the war and who has been accused by some historians of doing too little to condemn the Holocaust. The files revealed that the Vatican knew more than it had admitted about the deportation of Jews. But the archives of the Vatican relief organizations from the post-war years, the ones that issued documents to fugitives, remain only partially accessible. This is the question that no official answer has ever fully closed in a satisfactory way. You may be asking yourself, this happened 80 years ago. Why does it still matter? It matters for several reasons. It matters because most war criminals were never tried. Of the approximately 8,000 to 10,000 people who directly participated in the administration of the Nazi extermination camps, fewer than 10% were formally charged. Less than 5% were convicted. Only a tiny fraction served a sentence proportional to the crime. It matters because the money kept circulating. Fortunes of criminal origin were laundered, reinvested, and transformed into legitimate businesses. Part of that wealth is likely still in circulation today in some form. It matters because the mechanisms that allowed the escape, the combination of corrupt bureaucracy, institutional complicity, political pragmatism, and convenient silence, are not unique to 1945. These mechanisms exist in any system. And it matters because the Holocaust did not happen on another planet. It happened in Western Europe, in the heart of what was called Christian civilization, in a country that had produced Goethe, Beethoven, and Kant. If it happened there, it can happen anywhere. Operation Eagle Flight is not just the story of how criminals escaped. It is the story of how institutions failed, how pragmatism defeated justice, how the future was placed above responsibility for the past. It is a story about what happens when the world decides it is more convenient to forget than to remember. In 2023, the organization led by Ephraim Zuroff from the Simon Wiesenthal Center released its annual list of the most wanted Nazi war criminals. The names that appear today belong to people in their 90s and even 100 years old. Time is the greatest ally of criminals who survived the Nuremberg Trials. In recent years, several historic trials have still taken place in Germany. In 2016, Reinhold Hanning, a 94-year-old former Auschwitz guard, was sentenced to 5 years in prison by the court in Detmold. In 2021, a 100-year-old man, a former guard at the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, was tried in Germany. These trials are symbolically powerful. But each one that happens is also a painful reminder of how many were never tried. The last survivors of the Holocaust are dying. In a few years, there will be no one left alive to say, "I was there. I saw it. I survived." That is the exact moment historical revisionists are waiting for. The moment when the crime becomes only text in a book, and text can be reinterpreted, disputed, and relativized. That is why this story needs to be told. That is why the archives must continue to be opened. That is why the names must continue to be spoken. Operation Eagle Flight, whether as a formal organization or as a network of informal systems that produce the same outcome, represents one of the greatest failures of justice in the 20th century. Millions died. Their killers escaped. The institutions that should have delivered the guilty to justice chose convenience. The governments that should have cooperated chose political pragmatism. The banks that should have frozen the assets chose profit. And Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Paraguay, and Chile became, voluntarily or involuntarily, the cemeteries of international justice. But there is something more that the story of Operation Eagle Flight teaches us. It teaches us that truth has a different timeline than crime. That declassified documents continue to emerge decades later. That persistent researchers continue to find connections that contemporaries did not want to see. That the past rarely remains buried forever. Globoknik swallowed cyanide. Eichmann was hanged. Stengel spent his final years in a prison. Mengele drowned. Barbie died in a French prison. Priepke died under house arrest in Rome. It was not perfect justice. It was not swift justice. In many cases, it was not sufficient justice. But it was what we managed to achieve. And the question this chapter of history leaves us with is a question about ourselves, about our own time, and about the complicities we accept out of convenience. When you see an injustice being committed and look the other way because it is easier, you are repeating the exact same pattern that allowed men with blood on their hands to live peacefully for decades. If this video reached you, it is because you are the kind of person who does not settle for the official version. Someone who wants to understand what really happened. Someone who believes that historical memory is not optional. It is a moral obligation. Share this content with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to the channel to receive every new episode as soon as it is released. Leave your comment below with what you already knew and what surprised you in this story. Every view, every comment, every share is a way to ensure this content reaches more people. It is a way of saying that memory matters, that justice matters, that the past cannot be buried for the sake of convenience. History is trying to tell us something. The question is whether we will listen.